Hi everyone and welcome back. Today I want to talk about sketching palettes and specifically landscape sketching palettes. So when we think about landscape sketching or painting, it's so easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer variety of colors out there. And I just want to share a little bit of behind the scenes that shows my different landscape sketching palettes, all of the palettes that I use. I want to talk about how downsizing your selection of pigments can actually lead to more cohesive and atmospheric paintings. So we're going to look at a few different palettes that I keep around to sketch landscapes, from a bigger palette to a fairly minimal setup. So let's dive in. Let's start with this palette. You could say this is a big landscape palette. It has 18 colors, and as you can see, it's still fairly lightweight. I like these small metal palettes. They're really flexible to use. So this is really just my everyday sketching kit, and it's really fairly portable but holds 18 colors. So you might already know this specific palette if you followed me for a while. I use it all the time, and if you want to see me set it up, I have done a video about this and also a blog post. And a palette like this is a good all-rounder. It will work for any kind of subject, not just landscapes. So it's based on the split primary palette, in which you add a warm and a cool version of each primary color. So yellow, red, and blue. You can see a couple of choices of each of these primary colors here. And it also has a few extras like earth colors and green, orange, turquoise, violet, and even a black. So please feel encouraged to remove a black from any of your landscape palettes. It's just in here because I use this small palette for all kinds of subjects, so I just leave it in. And this palette has some additions that I could mix from some of the other colors, from some of the primary colors, like the cool green, the turquoise, or the orange. I could easily mix it from my red and yellow. But I like that I can have quick access to these colors without the need to mix them first. And this gives me some extra flexibility, and mixing takes up a bit less time. Here is a swatch card that I did for this palette, so you can see there's quite the broad selection of pigments. And my goal with this palette isn't just to have every color on the palette, but to have specific shortcuts that I know will work in my landscape sketch. So the bonus is, in such a bigger palette, you can have room for several earth tones like yellow ochre, burnt sienna, some ambers, which are a good base for very natural looking landscapes. Then bringing a convenience green to any palette is also great. While I love mixing greens, I like to have one stable green like this kind of sap green. It just saves a lot of time, and I can always modify the green I have, so I almost never use this as it is, but I tend to mix in a little bit of blue or yellow or red, and this modifies the green and makes it seem a little bit more natural. And of course, the benefit of a larger palette is that you have almost any light situation covered. But of course, you'll also have more choices for mixing and need a little bit of practice to choose mixes that work for your painting. Next up is a 9-color palette, and this has a very interesting shape. I really like this one. And you can see I've used this a lot recently. I need to refill some of the pans. This is the palette that I've used for my upcoming short class about luminous landscapes. It still loosely follows the split primary palette setup, so it has one fairly balanced yellow, then a cool pink, a warm red, cooler and warmer blue, a violet, and a green for more convenience, plus 2 earth colors. So yellow ochre and burnt sienna, and both of these are absolute classics for landscape palettes. And the yellow ochre has a double duty here as the warm yellow. So with this kind of palette, you have all the ingredients for most landscape scenes, at least for the kind of light and landscape that I encounter here. I'm based in Central Europe, in Germany. So this is a great palette because it forces you to mix your colors more than a bigger palette would, but it still offers enough mixing options to get a harmonious and balanced landscape sketch, because the same base colors appear throughout your sketch over and over. And it still has pigments that are very distinct from each other, so that they can stand out and create color contrasts or different color temperatures. Let's look at the next one. This is quite a minimal landscape palette. It has 5, or you could argue even 4 colors. And if you want to minimize it even further, then stick to a primary triad of yellow, red and blue. You can get a lot of brush miles or mixing miles with this one. And I usually pick a warm blue like an ultramarine or even a cobalt blue, then an earth yellow like a raw sienna or yellow ochre, and an earth red like a burnt sienna or transparent iron oxide. These come in all kinds of different names, but they're basically always the same kind of pigments. And then I also have a sap green and optional a titanium white. And my pigment choices here might seem a bit limiting at first, because my yellow, so this yellow ochre, and red, the burnt sienna, are really dull earth colors, but they are great mixes with the blue. And they also serve a purpose, because by limiting the brightness of this palette, the overall range of this triad is much more natural. Let's take a look at this. You can actually see, if you ignore the last row here, you can see the range of this palette. And it's much more natural. There are many subdued neutral colors in this palette, and this is actually quite fitting for landscape painting. And I've added in a sap green to satisfy our wish for more vivid options to show greens. I've also added titanium white, which is not in this mix here, but you can change the saturation and create more soft mixes with white, or have white highlights, but you could also leave out the white entirely if you like. And this very limited palette is great for beginning landscape painters, because it will allow you to explore color and color theory and mixing in a safe way that doesn't make it too overwhelming. So you automatically get all of these great colors that you can see here, and a few more even. And there are not too many big color contrasts or highly saturated colors to combine, just a very balanced selection of pigments that work beautifully together to create this natural looking landscape sketch that you're after. And of course, you can change any of the components here to adapt this limited palette. So any earth red instead of burnt sienna will work here. You could also try out cobalt blue instead of ultramarine blue. It's a little bit more neutral. There's also a huge variety of sap greens out on the market and other convenience green mixes. And I also want to mention this option. This is sort of the absolute essentials palette. It has 1 color in it. If you really want to explore the essentials of painting, then you can absolutely sketch a quick landscape study with 1 color only, no matter which pigment or which medium you use. So you could use watercolor like here, or bring an ink pen, or just use a pencil. And the result you will have might even be more useful than a sketch in full color, because you'll essentially have a value study on your hands. And a good value study, a good value structure in your sketch is what holds everything together, really. So of course it makes sense to use a fairly dark pigment here, so that you have a huge range of different values. You could use, I think this is a neutral tint, so this fairly dark gray. You could also use something like an indigo blue or a dark red, so that you can really show the full value range from very dark to very light. Just to show you an example for this technique, this is from a time when I brought an ink-filled brush pen everywhere with me to do these small value sketches. So basically a brush pen filled with ink and then another one filled with water, and I created these small sketches. And it's really kind of fun to reduce the scope and the focus to fully explore contrasts and values instead of colors. And of course, you could also throw in a little bit of white, either a white gouache or an acrylic marker to have more options for highlights. But I kind of like the simplicity of these kind of sketches. And before we wrap up, I wanted to share a thought on these ready-made watercolor sets that are marketed as landscape themed. So I have two examples here. So this is the Kramer landscape set small. And then we have the Winsor & Newton Cotman. I believe this was called a Skyscape pocket set or something like this. And while they often have high quality pigments, and some of these are a really good starting point, I often find they include some colors that you might never use. You need sort of to understand what you are looking for in a palette that you want to use for landscape sketching. So I would always opt for a palette that includes some very mixable combinations of primary colors, like yellow, red, blue. We talked about this. You might even want to have a split primary setup. So you can see this is reflected in these palettes. You have different choices for yellows, for reds, and for blues even. So this is a good basic selection of colors. And even here, this was, I think, originally it just came with these colors here in the middle. So you have a basic yellow, then two reds, two blues, and some colors. I think this is a third blue, and then black and white. And this one from Kramer also has this black and white. So these, at least the black is always or almost always something you can remove for landscapes. So I would always opt for a palette that has this, at least this very minimal setup of primary colors. Of course, it makes sense to have a few natural and slightly muted earth colors in the mix. So these are always great for mixing. So the Kramer palette has a huge selection of earth colors, which is really nice, and some muted greens as well, which is a really great balanced palette. It's really fun to paint with this. And the Cotman palette is set up in a way so that you can add your own colors, which is also really cool. So overall, you will want a mix of bright and muted colors, and the tough part is probably to know which ones these are. I've also seen amazing landscape palettes that were put together with very bright, vivid pigments only. It's really all about knowing which pigments you can combine with each other to create these pleasing mixes that will work for your painting. And I hope I've given you some idea of what to look for in these kind of palettes. So my advice for these ready-made palettes would be to use those sets as a starting point and then modify them. And ideally, your palette should let you make flexible mixing choices and not limit you to paint the same kind of tinted sketch over and over. So I hope this gave you some inspiration to look at your own palette with fresh eyes and see if you want to make some changes to it. And let me know in the comments which of these setups you prefer. Do you enjoy the challenge of a very minimal setup, or do you like to bring all of the colors? Yeah, I hope this was fun for you. And if you want to learn more about picking colors for a palette from scratch, then check out my post on this topic. I've also got a video. And yeah, happy sketching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.